All right, chapter 27 is the last chapter that we are going to cover for exam two's material. And hopefully this will coincide well with what you're doing in lab as far as the favorite phylums are going. And I'm going to cover more sections in here than we're going to cover in lecture, just so you get the information twice, um, because this is such a big part of your lab. So we only need to cover for lecture sections 2, 3, 5, and 6. This is a really, really long chapter, but we're only going to do 2, 3, 5, and 6. But I think I'm going to cover a good chunk of section 4 uh, for the purpose of lab. So this chapter is really about this movement of animals onto land, continuing kind of that theme, the rise of animal diversity. And around the Cambrian explosion, which was 525 million years ago, we start seeing early fossil appearances of the major groups of living animals that we recognize today. And of course, as we talked about in other chapters, strata forms and it holds those fossils in there. These fossils are usually of hard parts of the body like the bones, and we're able to look at those and see what life was like before it looked like it looks on Earth today. And so here you can see kind of where we fall today and where these things arose millions and millions of years ago. So things that we think of as being pretty primitive, like sponges and cnidarians, which are jellyfish and things like that, just don't seem like living things even a lot of times. They arose quite a long, long time ago. But things that maybe are more advanced, like our chordates, things that have a central nervous cord, like fish, and we're also chordates also, we came along at quite a bit later in time. So fossils from that Cambrian period are including the first hard mineralized skeletons. So we know that around that time is when we started having mineralized skeletons. And what we notice in these fossils is that they are bilaterans. So what that means is that they have bilateral symmetry. We have, meaning that both sides are mirror images of one another. And this is an adaptation or an evolutionary trait that shows that they are more advanced than things that had radial symmetry. We'll talk about those in just a second. And we can also tell from those fossils that these were most likely hunting predators, and they had different adaptations so that they were able to predate on things. We start seeing sharper teeth, different types of jaws, that kind of thing. There's a lot of hypotheses regarding the cause of this Cambrian explosion. Why during the Cambrian time did we start seeing all of these things happen? And then why do things that happened previous to the Cambrian time, Ediacaran time, why are those things declining? And some of these hypotheses include that there were different predator-prey relationships, the development of different teeth, things choosing to feed on different things instead of only plants, for example. Of course, we believe that oxygen was rising, atmospheric oxygen was increasing, and so things were adapting differently. They were able to become faster and stronger because they had more oxygen. And then the evolution of the Hox gene complex, which we're not going to go into a whole lot of depth in. Just know that that's one of the three major hypotheses. So molecular clock estimates date the bilaterans to 100 million years ago, earlier than the oldest fossil, which lived over 560 million years ago. So these bilaterans came on quite a bit later on in time, right? And we start to see larger, well-defended eukaryotes, which were 542 or so million years ago, indicates that bilateran predators may have originated by that time. So since things are able to defend themselves in whatever adaptations they have, that would indicate that there must have been something that was predating upon them, that they evolved this adaptation. Animals in the early Cambrian oceans were very diverse morphologically, and we'll go into some pictures to show you how different they were from one another and how diverse they were. So Also, what we start to see and what I would understand are different types of animal body plans. So, body plans are sets of morphological and developmental traits that provide a basis for us to compare with other animals. And we're able to look at different body plans and group different animals into different taxonomic groups. And so, the three things that we're looking at are symmetry, tissues, and body cavities. I mentioned bilateral symmetry earlier. But some animals have radial symmetry, which is where they don't have a true front or back. They really don't have a right or left. No matter which way you cut them, they will be identical, right? If you cut a human from the top of your head down to your feet, you're going to be, and you peel it apart, each side should be a fairly mirror image of one another, right? If you cut us any other direction, diagonally, crossways, through the belly, it's not going to be a mirror image. So that's the main difference between radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry. So radial symmetry would be like a pot, right? Or a starfish, or this spongy cnidarian, whatever this thing is right here. No matter which way you slice it, you cut it down the middle, it's going to be the same no matter what. When you look at bilateral symmetry, there's only one way to make mirror images of either side. There's only one way to cut it down the middle. Same thing with our face, right? So bilaterally symmetrical animals have a dorsal, which is a top, and they have a ventral or a bottom side. I would know the difference between dorsal and ventral. They have a right and a left side. Anterior is the front and posterior is the back of us. And then most have sensory equipment, including a central nervous system concentrated at the anterior end. So our anterior end is going to be our head, right? The back of your head is your dorsal anterior side. The front of your face is your ventral posterior side. Many of the radial animals are pretty sessile, which means that they don't really move very much, right? They don't swim very well, or they're attached to the ground in some way. And bilateral animals are much more active because their central nervous system is enabling them to have a more coordinated movement. So it's the development of a central nervous system in the anterior part of the body that really tells us that these are more advanced animals. It's hard to understand or compare humans maybe to like this lobster, but showing that it has bilateral symmetry shows us that it's the start of a central nervous system. It's a more advanced animal than a starfish. Tissues are, remember that tissues are cells that are specialized group of cells that are combined together producing tissues, and those tissues go on to make organs, which make systems, which make the whole organism, right? So the next functional unit up from cells would be a tissue. And so during development of animals, in the embryo and as it grows, these germ layers give rise to different tissues, and then those different tissues give rise to the organism and eventually make that whole organism. And what we see in more advanced insects is that the zygote is that we see these different germ layers. So the zygote is when the egg and the sperm fuse. And as long as nothing happens to the zygote and it lives, it will eventually become a living thing, right? Well, the zygote has to divide and become multiple cells. We are not just one giant cell. We are many, 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 many different cells. When you grow, you're gaining more cells, right? Your cells are dividing, making more skin cells, larger bones, skeletal cells that make up that skeletal tissue. When you are an adult, you're not growing anymore, but you get fatter. You're making more fat cells as you eat and consume more calories. So the zygote is going to go through a stage where it just grows and grows and grows and makes many, many, many more stages. Eventually, it becomes this thing called a blastula. And the blastula is hollow on the inside. So you can see right here, there's nothing on the inside. So these cells have, here it's solid. And then once it makes too many cells, it starts to become hollow. And during this hollow stage, these cells down here, as they grow and grow and grow, instead of becoming a bigger ball, a bigger beach ball, the cells start to pucker on the inside. It's a process that's called gastrulation. And so then you start having cells on the inside, you have cells on the outside, and you start to see these different, what they call germ layers. So the ectoderm is the outer germ layer, kind of the blue stuff here on the outside, that gives rise to our outer covering. So the ectoderm is going to give rise to our epidermis, right? Our skin, and probably the outer lining of a lot of our organs, but also in some phyla, it gives rise to the central nervous system. The mesoderm is this kind of empty space between the yellow and the blue. And the mesoderm gives rise to muscles and other organs. So that's kind of easy for me to remember. Mesoderm muscles, but also other organs. A few of these real primitive groups, like the cnidarians, lack that mesoderm, but all bilaterally symmetric animals do have it. So when you take a cross section of an earthworm, they do have a mesoderm in the middle. And then I don't have a thing of it, but the endoderm is what's on the inside, and it gives rise to other organs usually, and our digestive system. Okay, so remember there were the three things that body plans, the important aspects of body plans: symmetry, we talked about, bilateral versus radial; tissues, we just talked about, and giving rise to these derms, right? And then the third one is body cavities. So most bilateral animals have a body cavity. We call it a coelom, C-O-E-L-O-M. And this is kind of a fluid or an air-filled space where the digestive tract starts to grow, between the digestive tract and the outer body of the wall. So we have a coelom, right? If you cut us in half, there's a kind of a hole in the middle. And this body cavity, since it's fluid spaced or air spaced, it acts as a cushion, right? It's an air cushion or a fluid cushion. And it also acts as a hydrostatic skeleton. If we did not have that, our skin would just kind of fall over our bones, right? Our muscles would just kind of droop. And so this allows things to defy gravity, in addition to the bones that we have. It also enables internal organs to move independently of the body wall, which means that our lungs are not growing out of our skin, the backside of our skin, right, inside of our back, or our stomach isn't actually attached to the skin of our stomach. It can move inside there. So when you run or you're in an accident, you kind of have more cushion. Things are bouncing around inside of your body softly. Imagine it as like the amniotic fluid that surrounds a baby inside of the mother's stomach. It's protected by this wall of water, or in some cases air. So zoologists, so let's start looking now at like the diversification of animals and where they fall, who they're related to, and why they're related to those things. So zoologists recognize about 36 animal phyla or phylum, right? And remember, when all animals are in the domain Eukarya, there's this kingdom Animalia, and then beyond that is the phylum, and there's about a dozen different types of phylum. And then phylum is narrowed down even further to class, order, family, and finally genus and species. So here's kind of the general consensus of most books and most scientists and zoologists and taxonomists of the different types of phylum that we have, and there's a whole bunch of them that are, all of these are related to humans because they're animals. We're in the phylum Chordata, although we look nothing like a fish, right? But going back, phylum is a really broad umbrella that holds a lot of other things, right? So we're going to be grouped up with other animals that we share characteristics with, but may not look a single thing like. So the following points are reflected in the animal phylogeny. I would know these about animal phylogeny. All animals share a common ancestor. We don't know who that was, but 770 million years ago, during the Mesozoic time, we had this common ancestor. We all share it, and then from that, we start to diverge off. Sponges are basal animals. They're stagnant. They are the ones that, they don't move in real life, but they're the ones that that came off of the base of this common ancestor. So they are the most closely related to the common ancestor. We are much further related than the sponges or the porifera. Eumetazoa is a clade of animals with true tissues. Eumetazoans are these guys. So that once porifera branched off, eumetazoans came along, and that's where everybody else falls, right? Everyone down here, everyone is a eumetazoa. And so now we start to see true tissues. Remember we said that the sponges and that phylum Porifera does not have the mesoderm or even a coelom. Most animal phyla belong to the clade Bilateria. So here's our other clade over here, Bilateria. And the only one that doesn't are these cnidarians over here, which are like they're like jellyfish and things like that. Most animal phyla belong to the clade Bilateria, and most animals are invertebrates. They lack a backbone. Chordata is the only phylum that includes the vertebrates, which are animals with a backbone. And even within Chordata, having a chordate, being a chordate doesn't necessarily mean that you have vertebrae. It just means that you're a chordate. You have a cord that the central nervous system kind of runs up and down. So this is a small section, but it's the biggest. These are the biggest, largest animals that we notice, that we see with our eyes, and that we recognize as animals. All right, so bilaterians have diversified into three major clades: Lophotrochozoa, Ecdysozoa, and Deuterostomia, which you see here, here, and here. And I would not worry about knowing those terms very much. We know that bilaterian invertebrates account for 95% of the known animal species. They're morphologically diverse, and they occupy pretty much every habitat on Earth, if not almost every habitat on Earth. The vast majority of these invertebrate species, belong to the Lophotrochozoa and Ecdysozoa, which branched off over here, right? And it seems very funny that we would be more closely related to these than we would to, well, I guess not, than to worms and things like that, I guess. Okay, so there's that picture again for us. So that Lophotrochozoa are like these annelids, which are like earthworm type things. Earthworms are in the group Annelida. Rotifera, like rotifers, which are kind of parasites, and they can get into your gut and cause some major issues. And then ectoprocs, which are kind of a marine aquatic thing. Ecdysozoa, this is a group that will include nematodes like roundworms, and then also arthropods like spiders, insects or arthropods, crabs, crustaceans. Deuterostomia are the echinoderms, and then Hemichordata group, other types of things that are very worm-like. I would not worry so much about memorizing these. This is just kind of examples to let you know. You see these big words, and what are these things that we're talking about? So phylum Mollusca includes 100,000 species. Mollusks, I would know they have these three main parts that vary in size and form. They have this muscular foot that they use for movement, and that's what we eat when we eat oysters or shellfish like clams and things like that. There's a visceral mass that contains most of the internal organs, and the mantle, which is a fold of tissue that drapes over the visceral mass and secretes the actual shell. So the foot right here is what we eat. It's the big muscle. You have the mantle right here that's going to make the shell. And then where's our visceral? Oh, the visceral mass is kind of this whole kind of section. You're going to go over this quite a bit more in lab. And so some examples of these mollusks would be bivalves, like clams that have two valves to them, nudibranchs, and then cephalopods, which are squids and octopus and other things. It always amazes me that a cephalopod, like a squid or an octopus, seems to be more, they say that they do have a brain and that they can be quite intelligent, and yet they're related to these things like a clam that, looks like this and doesn't really seem to have much to it. Definitely doesn't seem to have an eye, or even a very advanced central nervous system. Arthropod origin. So more than 1 million arthropod species have been described. This is amazing, about 1 billion are estimated to exist on Earth. Most animals that you come across are going to be some sort of an arthropod. It's a very giant group of animals. And they're found everywhere. They're found in the air, on the ground, under the ground. They are found in more places than anything else is. And there are some insects that can live in volcanoes, not in the lava, but in parts where it's so incredibly hot that other things can't survive. They can survive in Antarctica, in places where it's so cold that you wouldn't think anything could live. They live in the water. They're pretty much found everywhere. And one of the reasons why they're found everywhere and they're so successful is that they have this hard exoskeleton that covers their body. And we know from fossils that this body plan is an old body plan that has served them well, and that's why it's continued throughout time. So we see very little variation from segment to segment in these early arthropods, meaning that all these little pieces that it has don't vary very much, which it's pretty consistent and symmetrical, which means that it's old, right? It is beneficial to have different body parts that might do different things, different segments that have different responsibilities for the body. So what we found over time is that arthropod evolution saw a decrease in the number of body segments, but an increase in appendage specialization. So now we have legs meant for running, we have antenna meant for doing certain things, we have the back part of an ant's body meant for defense or reproduction, the middle part of the ant's body, which contains the legs, and if it had wings, wings for locomotion, right? And here you can see a millipede has, these separate sections to its body and lots of legs meant for movement. So we see increasing complexity of the body plan. So that, I'm going to also cover a little bit of chapter 27.4 because I think it will help you, at least in lab. You can fast forward through this if you don't want to listen to it for lecture. But this concept covers vertebrates that have been the ocean's predominant predators for more than 400 million years. Vertebrates are named for vertebrae, which are the bones that make up our backbone, right? And the earliest ones probably evolved in the ocean. We have these old fossils of what that looked like. We call vertebrates, they're found in the phylum Chordata. Chordates are bilateran animals that belong to the animal clade Deuterostomia, right? All chordates share 4 derived characters. Some are present during the embryonic development only, and some go away. Like, for example, these 4 characters are the notochord, which is a flexible rod that provides support. We have that. A dorsal hollow nerve cord, which develops into the brain and the spinal cord. We have that as humans. These pharyngeal slits or pharyngeal clefts, which function in suspension feeding. So they're kind of like gills and part of the head. We don't have those as adults. They develop while we're embryos, but they go away as we get larger. And then a muscular postanal tail. Of course, we're not like a dog or a cat with a tail, but when we develop, we have a tail that starts to recede as we get bigger. So here you can see on a really primitive animal, they have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. They have a notochord that's going to develop into the central nervous system. Our notochord is surrounded by our vertebrae. A postanal tail, right, behind the anus, and pharyngeal gill slits meant for kind of sedentary feeding and breathing. And if you look at this picture, that schematic that compares different types of animals, if you were to look up developing embryos, it's really difficult to identify the difference between these and other things, because early on in development, we all look very similar. all chordates are going to look extremely similar to one another. And then as you start to develop and get more mature, these embryos change quite a bit. And obviously you can tell this is going to become a fish, looking quite different from these guys, but which all still look similar. And then continuing on, definitely a fish starts to look like a turtle, a bird, some other mammal, right? And then a human. Lancelets are a basal group of extant, living still, blade-shaped animals that closely resemble this idealized chordate, which is this guy up here. Really primitive, basically, is the point of what I'm trying to say, that lancelets are primitive chordates. Let's see, in addition to the features of all chordates, early vertebrates had a backbone, a skull, and a well-defined head with a brain and sensory organs. And we know that because, of course, of fossils. So vertebrates originated about 500 million years ago, and they were more efficient at capturing food than their ancestors were, which is why they continued and their ancestors did not. The earliest vertebrates in the fossil record lacked jaws, which wasn't very good for them. So there's only 2 living lineages of jawless vertebrates, which are these things called hagfish and lampreys, which are just really primitive aquatic marine animals. Today, vertebrates that have a jaw, which are called gnathostomes, outnumber all the little jawless vertebrates because it's more advantageous to have a jaw. And so here are examples of all of these things. We are in the tetrapod group, I believe, most closely related to them. So chondrichthyans are the sharks, rays, and relatives. They're things that are they're cartilaginous fish. So sharks and rays don't have cartilage in their bone. I'm sorry, they only have cartilage in their bone. They don't have true bones like we do. And then there's osteichthyes, which are ray-finned fish, or they're bony fish. They actually have bones to them, and these are the ones that we, generally that you eat. I'm going to skip through here. Okay, so that's just kind of giving you a quick example of how things developed in the water. Concept 5 is something that you need to know for lecture. Several animal groups had features that facilitated their colonization of land. So the fish, jawless fish and jawed fish and cartilaginous fish and bony fish, they of course live in the water, and something had to give to get these things to evolve, different and common ancestors to make those fish, but also to give rise to things that are going to move on land. And so some of these bilateral animals start colonizing land after the Cambrian explosion. And this caused some pretty profound changes to terrestrial communities. So life on land provided advantages and also posed a lot of challenges to early colonizers. Some of the advantages, there was the atmosphere had a lot higher oxygen concentration than aquatic environments. Higher oxygen is beneficial to anything. If you require oxygen for energy, which we ultimately do, it's going to be better for us, right? There's also new sources of food, and because there's nothing on land, there's a lot fewer competitors. So food is pretty much abundant until these populations grow so big. However, water is scarcer, so they have to somehow adapt to live on a drier condition with less and less water when they've lived in the water and it's always been surrounded by it and never known what it was to be dehydrated. Another challenge is that temperatures fluctuate quite a bit more between cold and hot on land than they do in water. Generally, water stays more constant temperature than the air does. And you see this when you go even to the coast, right? Down on the coast, the temperatures right on the water don't really fluctuate as much because the water keeps that air temperature a little bit more consistent. There's also no support against gravity. In the water, they don't really require strong bones or muscles or things to keep them upright. But on land, now they need something like that because they have the sensation of gravity having effect on them. Members of many animal groups made the transition to terrestrial life, and arthropods were among the first animals to colonize the land about 450 million years ago. And then vertebrates came along later. So I would know that arthropods were the first, vertebrates happened later. One thing to note is that the evolutionary changes that accompanied the transition from terrestrial life were much less extensive in animals than they actually were in plants, which may not necessarily seem like it would make sense, right? So algae had to start deriving roots. They had to get stems, a vascular system to bring water up above them. They have a cuticle now to prevent against desiccation. And then they have to have a different kind of a gas exchange with those stomata. Whereas when you look at these two different types of animals, really they already have all the things that they need, but now they derive a tracheal system, like insects have to have a way to breathe. Protection against desiccation over here. You've got eggs and scales, and then they've got to develop some sort of a limb to move around. So a lot less adaptations to move onto land for animals than it was for plants. Terrestrial lineages have arisen in several different arthropod groups. So remember, arthropods came on land before anything else did. And what arthropods are made up of are millipedes, spiders, crabs, insects, among some other things. General characteristics of arthropods. So appendages of some living arthropods are modified for function. So walking, feeding, sensory reception, reproduction, and defense. Like the appendages from which they were derived, these structures are jointed and paired. What makes an arthropod an arthropod is that it A, has an exoskeleton that covers its body, B, has jointed appendages, and C, that those appendages are paired. So just like we have one arm and a matching arm, right and a left foot, these arthropods, while they have many different feet here, right? They have 4 on this side, they're going to have 4 on the other side. Unless one falls off, they always have a pair that matches with it. So body of the arthropod is completely covered by a cuticle, an exoskeleton made of layers of protein and chitin. And this cuticle that covers them, this exoskeleton, is kind of waxy, and that allows them to retain moisture so they don't dehydrate. The exoskeleton provides structural support, attachment points for muscles, and protection from physical harm and desiccation. It also is limiting in that you will never see an ant as big as a dog, right? The exoskeleton is so heavy and hard that it keeps them small, because if they got that large, it would actually cave in and it would crush them. So it's beneficial and at the same time limiting. A variety of organs, they can also have a variety of organs specialized for gas exchange evolved in these arthropods. Different arthropods have different things. This crab or lobster has gills. Insects have holes in their body called spiracles. So they breathe different than we do. Insects and their relatives include more species than any other eukaryotic group combined. 1 out of every 5 animals you come across is going to be an insect. They live in almost every terrestrial habitat and also in fresh water. And we also do see some in marine environments. There are marine mammals, and there are lice that live on them. Lice are a type of insect. The oldest insect fossils date back to about 416 million years ago, and you can Google pictures of them, of like giant dragonflies that we have fossil records of. And we have fossil records of them because their body is fairly hard, and so the harder bodied insects did leave fossils behind for us to take a look at. Insects diversified several times following the evolution of flight. So insects that do not fly are most likely less evolved than those that do. Adaptations to feeding on gymnosperms and the expansion of angiosperms. So when we see different types of mouth parts on insects, those are adaptations to feed on the different plants that started to evolve and change around the same period of time. Insect and plant diversity declined during the Cretaceous extinction, but both groups have since rebounded. So it's a lot of coevolution. They evolve together. One evolves a defense mechanism so the insect can't feed on it. The insect starts to evolve another mechanism so it is able to feed on it, and it's a constant tug and pull between these two. Of course, some insects don't necessarily eat plants. They might eat other insects or other animals. The evolution of flight is one key to the great success of insects, and if you think about it, there's very few animals on the earth that actually have the ability to fly. The only groups are insects, which are, butterflies and ladybugs and beetles and wasps and all those things that are insects, bats and birds. Nothing else can fly. And insects are unique in that they have 4 wings as opposed to just having 2. And you can argue and say there's flying fish and there's flying squirrels, but they're able to glide. They can't actually go from the ground and fly up into the air like birds, bats, and insects can. So the ability to fly allows them to escape predators. They're able to find food, so they're able to get further to find food when they lose food, and also to disperse to new habitats a lot faster than if they were only able to crawl. And because wings are extensions of the cuticle, they don't lose any walking legs when these wings started to evolve. So they still maintain that they have 6 legs. Insects with wings don't lose a pair of legs to make up for it in wings, which is what birds and bats have done. Instead, they just grew extra wings, right? So they're entirely unique in that aspect. A key event in the colonization of land occurred when the fins of some lobe-finned animals evolved limbs and feet of things that we call tetrapods. So this animal, nicknamed a fishapod, Tiktaalik, I think is how you would pronounce it. Fossil animal, it had both fish and tetrapod characteristics. A pod is a foot. Tetra is many or 4, I'm not really sure. But it basically means that they have multiple feet. Think pods that will allow them to move. So this fishapod had fish, gills, lungs, and scales. So it was like a combination of a lot of animals smushed together. So it's makes perfect sense that it would diverge and make multiple things, right? Or think multiple things would arise from it. It didn't necessarily make it. It had ribs to breathe air and support its body. It had a neck and shoulders. It had fins with a bone pattern of a limb. And here's kind of a look at what it looks like. So to me, they call it a fishapod, but it looks like quite a bit in its head, like a crocodile, right? Or an alligator. So it had eyes on the top of its skull, which means that it probably sat on the ground and looked up to feed. It had a flat skull. It had a neck, which means that it can move and turn, and it is able to search out for prey. So that's kind of important. Ribs are important because it means that it supports the lungs. It has a diaphragm now so that it can breathe, right? It had scales on its body, which probably was an adaptation for living on land, right? It did also have fins, so it must have probably been in the water as well. And then it also had a lot of starting to look like a lot of the bones that we see in our arms and other animals' arms. So it probably could prop itself up on its fins in the water, but it probably couldn't walk very well on land based on the way that the bones look. It is older than the oldest tetrapod, so it's older than the oldest thing that looks like a giraffe or a human or a reptile, right? And its traits were ancestral to the tetrapod lineage. Fins became progressively more limb-like over evolutionary time, leading to the first appearance of tetrapods 365 million years ago. So if you look at the limbs over here, they start to become much more like something that's useful as something to move on land. So this is all a fin, right? And then it starts to you get these bones in here that start to separate out, become larger. That's pretty fin-like to me. Then you see this over here, right? Now you start to see digits and then more digits. And then it becomes what we are. Amphibians are represented by 6,000 plus different species, which are salamanders, frogs, caecilians. Many of the amphibians have gilled breathing aquatic larvae that undergo metamorphosis into a lung breathing adult that live on land. And these characteristics tell us that these are probably the first things to move away from life in the water. But amphibians always have to be in a moist environment, right? So they are the oldest of kind of the tetrapod group. They're the oldest of those kind of that look that we think of as animals on land. So tetrapods, here's, there's reptiles and there's mammals, and amphibians are older. They're kind of a basal lineage, right? Whereas reptiles and mammals had a common ancestor, and then from that arose reptiles and mammals. So amphibians are restricted to damp habitats. Their eggs lack a shell, and so they're vulnerable to desiccation, so they have to lay their eggs in the water or in very moist environments. And their skin is always very slimy and wet, and that it's kept moist so that they can facilitate gas exchange through the skin. So here's examples: Caecilians, or like, I guess that would be like the newt group maybe, but frogs, toads, salamanders, these are all things that are related to, that are all amphibians. And then just a little side note, amphibian populations are declining because there's this fungus that is knocking them out. There's a lot of habitat loss, there's a lot of climate change, and then of course pollution, especially in water, is declining their population. So at least 9 amphibian species have gone extinct in the past 40 years, and more than hundreds of others may have been lost in that time also. But we just know, there are lots of species that we haven't recognized yet. All right, so amphibians, much more primitive than reptiles, birds, and mammals. And so this last concept to cover are the amniotes. So amniotes have key adaptations for life in a wide range of terrestrial environments. So amniotes are able to really live on water. They've been able to separate from a liquid environment a lot better than the amphibians have. Of course, we all still need water to survive, but they don't need it for reproduction or for breathing or other necessary things for life. Amniotes colonized a more extensive range of dry habitats than did amphibians. Amniotes are a group of tetrapods whose living members are reptiles, including birds and mammals. Amniotes are named for the major derived character of the clade, the amniotic egg, which contains 4 membranes to protect the embryo. So all these guys that we're going to talk about have amniotic eggs, or amniotic sacs that their eggs develop in, right? Specialized membranes are the amnion, the chorion, the yolk sac, and the allantois. And I would understand that these are all things, that these terms are all things that help protect the embryo and are found only in the embryonic group, but you don't need to know specifically what each one does. So the amniotic eggs of most reptiles and some mammals have a shell. The shell slows dehydration of the egg in the air, and most mammals have lost that eggshell, and instead they develop inside the mother's body, and the mother gives rise to live birth, right? Another really important adaptation of the amniotes is that we have a rib cage that ventilates the lungs. So we have this diaphragm that moves and closes and kind of helps pump our lungs on the inside. While our lung is a muscle, that an organ has a muscle that can, make it move. Think about what happens if you have to have CPR, right? They pump on your body, they move the ribs to try to get the lungs going and the heart going also. So this efficient ventilation of the rib cage allows for less permeable skin and better water conservation. We don't have to have that slimy skin that amphibians have. So amphibians and the amniotes split off about 350 million years ago. Early amniotes lived in warm, moist habitats before they started to expand to more drier habitats. And there's 2 large terrestrial clades, reptiles and mammals. Reptiles also include birds, so remember that. So the earliest reptiles lived about 310 million years ago. Living members of the reptile clade include tuataras, lizards, snakes, turtles, crocodiles, and birds. We hear that all the time, right? Birds are related to more closely related to reptiles than anything else. Birds originated from a common ancestor with dinosaurs, and I'm sure you've heard that before too, that birds are closely related to dinosaurs. They didn't evolve from dinosaurs, they had a common ancestor, and birds came along later. So here you can see kind of where things fall out. So here we have our common ancestor of reptiles. We're not even looking at mammals. But common ancestor of reptiles, early divergent here, put on these squamates and tuataras, which are like iguanas and other lizards, right? Lizards, pretty much. And squamates are snakes. And then over here you got turtles that evolved very early, and then lots of other common ancestors that gave rise to many other things. So reptiles share several derived characters. They have scales that create a waterproof barrier. They have internal fertilization and they lay a shelled egg on land. Internal fertilization is important because if it was external, probably requires water to move the sperm to the egg, right? There has to be some vehicle to get it there. But internal fertilization is much more efficient because the sperm is directly inserted to where the egg is. Most of these reptiles are ectothermic, which means that they're the term cold-blooded, which isn't actually a great accurate term to use because they don't actually have cold blood, but they get their heat from the external temperature. So if you've ever had an iguana or a lizard as a pet and it got cold, you run it under warm water, or you set it in the windowsill where it's warm. Eventually it's going to come back to life, but when they're cold, they don't move very much, right? Birds, on the other hand, as well as humans, are endothermic, which means that our metabolism maintains our body temperature. So it doesn't really matter what the temperature is outside. Inside, we will still function. We'll be cold on the outside, but inside our body will still function. It will not slow down because metabolism is what gives us our heat. Reptiles comprise two large clades. One includes the tuataras and the squamates, which are lizards and snakes, and the other are the turtles, the crocodiles, and the birds. So let's look up here again. So two different clades, turtles, crocodiles, and the birds. These are all extinct, and then lizards and the snakes. So two different clades. Birds are considered a diverse group of flying reptiles that evolved about 160 million years ago. So they're pretty young, right? Birds have weight-saving adaptations for flight, so I would know what their adaptations are that allow them to do what they're able to do. They lack a urinary bladder, so a bird does not pee. When it poops on your car, it's peeing and pooping at the same time, and that's why it has the white with the black, because it's the uric acid mixed all together. Females of most species have only one ovary instead of two, and they have really small gonads except during breeding season. They also lack teeth. But of course, the adaptations for flight that we recognize are that they have wings and they have feathers, which are very light and help them have a lot of surface area to gain wind. Large pectoral or breast muscles so that they can pump those wings. A keel on the sternum, they have a breastbone that anchors to the pectoral muscles. They have really efficient respiratory and circulatory systems. We start seeing a four-chambered heart with these guys. They have color vision and very acute eyesight, which is twofold, great for predatory birds and also great for the prey. And well-developed visual and motor areas of the brain. And of course, the bone structure, right? Meaning where it's got, they have hollow bones so that they don't weigh as much. And they're able to fly. But if you've ever held a really heavy bird, they have some significant weight to them. Mammals are the other extant, which means living, lineage of amniotes. And we have many derived traits. So if you're a mammal, you have mammary glands that produce milk. The easy one is that it's hair, right? So the two that most people think of are that we produce milk, we have mammary glands, and the most easy one is that we have hair. But there's other things that we have that make us mammals. You have a fat layer under the skin. You have a kidney, which conserves water during waste removal. We have a high metabolic rate due to the endothermy. We have a relatively large brain, and we have differentiated teeth. So we have teeth meant for ripping meat, and we have teeth meant for chewing in the back. So we're a lot more advanced than other things like reptiles are. Here's what's kind of funny for us. So mammals evolved from these things called synapsids, which were the first true mammals, and they were about 180 million years ago, and they looked a lot like lizards, and these synapsids gave rise to other things like other dinosaur-like things. Even though they look nothing like a mammal, they are what we came from. So by 140 million years ago, the three living lineages of mammals had emerged. We have monotremes, egg-laying mammals, not very many of them, marsupials, mammals that have a pouch, and then eutherians, which are the most numerous, the placental mammals. So monotremes are like, they lay little little tiny eggs. I forget what that little animal is. I forget what it's called. Marsupials are like kangaroos, right? And wallabies and things like that. They have a pouch that their baby lives inside of and develops inside of also. And then eutherians, which are those that give rise to live birth. Primates are a group of eutherians that include lemurs, tarsiers, monkeys, apes. And then humans are part of the ape group. So all of these guys, everybody here is a primate. But the apes arose over here and gave rise to, so gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and then this guy that's extinct, and humans, and all the humans, the Homo species are all, we are considered in the ape group. Monkeys are not apes. Lemurs are not apes. Many derived traits of primates are adaptations to life in trees. We have, we and monkeys and lemurs have grasping hands and feet. We have that separate movable thumb that separates us from raccoons and from cows and other things. Monkeys and apes have opposable thumbs, right? Just like we do. Large brains and short jaws. Forward-looking eyes with really good depth perception. So we start to, as the eyes start to move forward, that tells us that we are now hunting, right? We're looking for our prey or actively looking for things. We're not so much worried about what's coming after us. We start to rise up in the animal kingdom. Non-human apes are only found in tropical regions of Africa and Asia. You won't find monkeys in Mexico. Actually, you'll find monkeys there, sorry, but you won't find apes like chimps and gibbons and things like that. Our monkeys are primates, but they're not apes. Apes have, and I don't even know if monkeys are in Mexico, but I know they're in Costa Rica and Belize and places like that. Apes have larger brains in proportion to their body, and they have a more flexible behavior than other primates do. So we're able to move around a little bit better. We're able to adapt also to different environments and to different situations, showing that we have a more advanced brain that can help us survive. Humans are primates. We're nested in the group informally called apes, so humans are considered apes. A number of characters distinguish humans from other apes: upright posture and bipedal locomotion. So instead of, if you think of like a gorilla, when it moves, or even a chimp, when it moves, it uses its while it can stand upright, it uses its front legs to help it move, and we do not do that. So we start to see longer legs, shorter arms. We stand upright, and bipedal locomotion, meaning 2 feet. We only move with 2 feet. We don't use our arms to help us move. Larger brains capable of language. We have symbolic thought, we have artistic expression, and the use of complex tools. Chimps are the closest living relatives to humans. 99% of our genomes are identical to chimpanzees. The lineage leading to humans diverged from chimps and other apes 6 to 7 million years ago. Humans and their extinct human ancestors comprised the hominins. So what are humans? We're in a group called the hominins. We are an ape, but we're all apes, right? But chimps are not hominins, only humans are. So evolution of the bipedalism preceded the evolution of the increased brain size in human ancestors. So increased brain size came along later. Instead, we started to move on 2 feet first. And if you look at the species of this guy to the right, he had a really tiny brain compared to humans, Homo sapiens. but starts to exhibit that they're moving on 2 feet instead. So brain size, body size, and tool use increased over time with the Homo species. And so like Neanderthals and, or not, well, not Neanderthals, they're different, but like Homo sapiens, before Homo sapiens, it was Homo erectus and I think and other things. As those guys evolved, they started becoming more like we are, right? The oldest Homo sapiens fossils are from 2 specimens in Ethiopia, and they date almost 200,000 years ago. So we know that Homo sapiens have been around for at least that amount of time. And all living humans have ancestors that originated as Homo sapiens in Africa. So unless we find fossils somewhere else, we know that Africa was the start of all the Homo sapiens, and specifically Ethiopia, or what is today called Ethiopia. Humans dispersed out of Africa and into Asia, which, at the time was the closest place, and then to Europe, and then to Australia, and then finally onto the New World. And we shared morphological characteristics, and analysis of DNA extracted from a fossil human jawbone indicate that humans were interbreeding with Neanderthals, which is interesting because a lot of times you think that Neanderthals or cavemen died before humans arose, right? But that actually isn't the case. We lived on the earth at the same time and were able to interbreed with one another and produce, who knows about producing offspring, but well, yeah, they did produce offspring if they were able to find jaws that had both of that DNA. I think that's the last slide for this chapter.